Penelope, or Penny, as I've always called her, and I have been married for 28 years. Our 28th year marked an ending but also a beginning. It was the year our third and youngest child started college. We just dropped her off. That made us officially empty nesters. I wanted to use the opportunity to try to reignite Penny's and my love life, which had waned during the marriage, due mostly to lack of energy and privacy. As working-class people, we have a small house with thin walls, not a huge mansion with nannies and maids. I thought all was on track for my plan to succeed. As soon as we arrived home, I carried Penny upstairs and, despite her protests of, "Mike, my back is sore from the trip, and let me have a shower first." Penny is a nurse and had been training as such when we met. With time taken off to have babies, then time and money constraints from raising them, Penny had remained a general nurse. Over the years, she'd seen and commented on many occasions about younger nurses coming in, fresh out of school, doing some basic courses and being promoted away, or even worse, promoted over her. To say she resented it was like saying the Pope was a little Catholic. In the aftermath of a truly sensational experience, I was introduced to what was obviously a well-thought-out plan on her part. According to Penny, there was a looming chronic shortage of pediatric nurses at the hospital where she worked. An intense, 6-month training course would put Penny in a good position to stay at the same hospital. She knew for a fact that the head nurse in the same department at the town's other hospital was retiring in 2 years' time, and she'd be in the running for that vacancy. That, in turn, would put Penny in the prime position to take over from the matron of her current hospital when she was due for retirement in 5 years. That was the ultimate prize Penny had her eyes on. She'd done her research and found she could be paid while doing the 6 months of training, so wouldn't be a burden on my modest income. Then her enhanced salary would help us toward our goal of retiring at 60 with a comfortable bank account. I looked at Penny, marveling at this newfound ambition on her part. It was like seeing her for the first time scary and exciting. I realized my wife was still able to surprise me and scare me. With evidence that much thought had gone into it, I wondered why I was only hearing about it for the first time right now. Why hadn't she used me as a sounding board, asked my help? Why had she kept these hopes, dreams, and plans from me? Hadn't I always encouraged her? Even now, with a kernel of concern growing in my gut, I leaned toward encouraging her dream. That is, until the reason for her hesitation was revealed. The only place Penny could do the course was in another state, an hour and $250 flight away. 6 months. That's a long time, Pen. Is there nothing closer? Do they offer an online course? No, they don't, and it's not that long a time. It will fly by. In times of war, couples did it all the time. Heck, they went years with only letters to sustain them. And surely we can afford for you to fly up once a month. I remained silent, running questions and answers through my mind. Before I could voice any objections, or even ask more questions, Penny snapped at me, "Mike, don't be so insensitive." That got my hackles up. I'd never been insensitive. Not with her, and not with our daughters. I was so offended I almost missed the rest of her response. If this was about you and your career, I would be expected by the whole darn world to support and encourage you, but because I'm a woman, you're making out I'm being selfish for wanting you to support me in my dream. Selfish? When had I even had the chance to make such an accusation? I'd hardly had a chance to put a word in. I took a deep breath, willing myself to stay calm. Getting angry wasn't going to get either of us anywhere. Pen, I'm not being selfish nor accusing you of it. I'm just trying to get my head around it all. You've clearly given this a great deal of thought over an extended period of time, whereas I've had all of 10 minutes. Penny immediately looked sorry. Her tone went from demanding to neutral as she explained things further. By staying in student nurse housing and working at the teaching hospital, the drain on our retirement funds would be minimized. Penny flying home within the 6 months was probably impractical, given how busy she would be, but it wasn't unreasonable that I could fly up every month or so to spend the weekend together. It all sounded so reasonable, but I have to say, the difference between my plans for the near future and Penny's threw me, and I think in hindsight, made me vulnerable. Penny began nibbling my ear, initiating a welcome round 2, and effectively silenced any questions I might still have. Ask any starved bloke. They'll say yes to just about anything in those circumstances. I said yes to Penny attending the next course. The last unexpected news came when she climbed on board for a ride the course commenced the following week. In the aftermath, my well-thought-out questions meant nothing I'd already agreed, remember? I felt manipulated. Penny left after a flurry of activity. She was like a kid heading off to their first camp. She was so excited she barely remembered to give me a goodbye hug. I'm embarrassed to say I struggled to establish a new routine. I hadn't needed to think about what I would be doing in my leisure time for years. I was guilty of leaving the planning of our social lives to Penny. As long as she allocated time for my side of the family, I was happy for her to take charge of that aspect of our life. I wasn't alone in that. I knew the same applied to most of the guys I worked with. Between Penny and the kids, most evenings and weekends had been filled with things Penny had organized and committed us to, or my getting on with the necessities of life like mowing lawns, washing cars, and running kids to and from sporting events. Now, from 6 in the evening when I got home from work, to 10 or 11 at night, I was lonely and bored. It wasn't that I was used to going out all the time, because we'd certainly never been like that. But now there was no one to comment to when the newsreader informed us of yet another stupid mistake made by one of our politicians, or to hold hands and laugh with as we watched one of our favorite shows. I even missed giving Penny's feet a rub. The first week Penny was gone, we spoke nightly for about 30 minutes. I must admit to wondering if she'd factored our escalating phone bill into all her planning and budgeting. I must also confess to feeling jealous. She was clearly busy and enjoying the new challenge. She dominated our conversations with all her news. Her excitement was palpable. Names of people I didn't know got thrown nonchalantly in. It made me feel excluded, like I had no place in this phase of her life. Having said that, our conversations always ended quite lovingly and gave me hope. Perhaps absence would make our hearts fonder, so that when she returned we could go with my plans about reigniting our love life. As early as the second week, our 30-minute nightly calls reduced to 20 minutes duration because Penny said she needed to study, and our conversations got her out of her nursing mindset. That hurt. I was now pushed to the side. I tried to always end our calls on a loving note, but by the end of the week it felt somewhat one-sided. Regardless, I tried to remain encouraging and supportive, keeping my frustrations and loneliness to myself. By the third week she asked that we only call each other every second night and, oddly, suggested she be the one to call me, not the other way around. That way, she said, I wouldn't be interrupting her at inconvenient times. By the fourth week I received only 2 calls. I tried to be understanding. She had her first major assignment due and was on evening shift, but it was hard. I was grateful that come the weekend I'd be flying up to see her. I missed her. I missed us. Fate had other ideas. My planned trip had to be canceled at the last moment as Penny said there'd been a flu outbreak and the hospital was overrun with patients. It was all hands on deck at the teaching hospital. That weekend did pay some dividend, though. While refueling, I ran into an old mate of mine who I'd drifted away from over the years. He and a bunch of his mates played poker at a local pub every Saturday night. He invited me to join them, and considering I was sick of being at a loose end and forgotten by my wife, I went along. They were a nice group. We played a few friendly hands in the back room, then retired to the bar for some relaxing drinks. After years of having my social life consisting of neighborhood BBQs, small local family-style bistros, and child-centered events, the pub was a bit of an eye-opener. I was quite stunned by the number of apparently single ladies my age or slightly younger who boldly came up to me and, quite frankly, tried to flirt with me. Funny how you forget that sort of thing goes on in bars after a few years of wedded bliss and diapers. It took 3 Saturdays, and I'll admit, a bunch of other days of the week, when it was clear Penny wasn't calling that night, before being flirted with became a regular enough experience to not be passed off as a coincidence. I asked my mate Jeff what the deal was. Mike, you really have been out of circulation, haven't you? Have you not noticed that by our age the single women already outnumber the single men noticeably? What you're seeing are the widows, the dumped for a younger model, the kick the middle-aged jerkouts. But why me? Crikey, Mike. You've been married so long that your confidence as a man is intrinsically linked to what your wife thinks and says. Look in the mirror, then look around you, mate. You're better looking than most, and because of your physical job, you're still lean and muscled. You don't have a wife riding shotgun on you, and you're not at home with kids. Mate, if you were to take off that wedding ring, you'd get attention within 2 hours without having used one cheesy chat-up line or bought so much as a single drink. I looked around, noting more than one interested glance. Jeff followed my gaze. I'm not looking to go behind Penny's back, Jeff. I understand that, but let's just say, for the sake of discussion, that you are single. If I were in your shoes, I'd steer clear of the overly forward ones. They're all dressed up tonight, trying to find a man. Honestly, half of them are probably already married and just looking for a fling. The same probably goes for half the guys here as well. Look at that table over there. Geoff pointed to a table where a sad-looking woman in her 40s sat with her friends. The woman who looks downcast might have recently gone through a breakup and is seeking comfort from her friends. In a few weeks, she'll probably be back, looking for some quick connections to prove she's still attractive and that the breakup wasn't her fault. Or maybe she's seeking revenge. If you're looking for a casual encounter, you can come back then or avoid showing your wedding ring to the people who approach you. It all depends on what you're looking for. If you're interested in something more long-term, then check out that table over there. Geoff gestured towards another table where 4 women around my age were laughing and having a good time. I noticed that 2 of them wore wedding rings while the other 2 did not. As we observed, 3 of them glanced around the room. Now, that's where I would focus my attention if I were single. They're a group of colleagues having a good time together. 2 of them are married, but one doesn't let that stop her. The other 2 are single but not desperate. They might be open to an opportunity if it presents itself, but they won't actively seek it out. Just then, I received a text message from Penny apologizing for not being able to call because of work. I tried to appreciate the fact that she at least texted me, but it was hard. With each passing day, our communication was decreasing, and it was difficult to be grateful. Still, she ended the text with a quick love you, which was better than her previous messages. I replied with a love you too before turning to Geoff to continue our conversation. All right, I'll prove my point. Take off your ring, go to the bar closest to that table, and order a drink. I followed his suggestion. As I leaned against the counter, waiting to be served, I discreetly kept an eye on the table. It didn't take more than a minute before one of the married women hastily removed her own ring and approached me. She boldly asked if she could buy me a drink but lost interest as soon as I mentioned that I was married. I also pointed out that I had seen her take off her own wedding ring. She blushed in embarrassment. Meanwhile, the rest of her table watched as she returned, and one of the single women immediately came over. She approached me just as the bartender arrived to take my order. She patiently waited for her own drink before engaging in polite conversation. However, I could tell from her body language that she wasn't my type, and I'm sure my body language gave that away as well. She soon returned to her table with a round of drinks. I continued sipping my drink, waiting for Geoff to return from the restroom so I could tell him how accurate his observations were. That's when I heard a soft hi from behind me. I turned around and saw the second single woman from the table looking at me confidently. Based on what I had learned about the single scene, I figured she was giving me an opportunity but wouldn't be devastated if nothing came of it. If I were single, she would have been my type. It was difficult to determine her age. She could have been around my age or a few years younger. She had an attractive appearance, slim but healthy, with soft, honey blonde hair framing her face, and a genuine smile. I discreetly checked her ring finger, but there was no shadow indicating a ring. I then looked at my own hand and realized that I didn't wear my ring often due to my job, so I too appeared ringless. Tradition dictated that I offer to buy her a drink. No need, she said, raising her glass and tilting it gently before taking a sip. She exuded confidence, and it was clear that she was comfortable in her own skin. We started an easy conversation, discussing various topics. After about 10 minutes, I felt compelled to admit that I was actually married but wasn't wearing my ring. I could have made up a story about where it was and why it wasn't on my finger, but I felt compelled to be completely honest with Andrea, the attractive blonde. She questioned my behavior, which, on the surface, seemed sneaky and dishonest. In my defense, one of your friends approached me not long ago. She wasn't even subtle about taking off her rings and putting them in her pocket. That would be Carol. She's not really my friend, I just met her tonight. She came with Sue, who is my friend. They work together. To be honest, I was surprised when I saw her actions too. It makes you feel sorry for her husband, doesn't it? I nodded. Just so you know, I didn't take off my ring because I wanted to pursue something, but because I wanted to test out my friend Jeff's theory about women our age at bars. Andrea chuckled when I explained all of Jeff's theories in detail. In general, she agreed with him. Our conversation continued from there, eventually turning to Penny. My wife has been training out of state for almost 2 months, and I hate to admit it, but I feel lost without her. You must miss her. I nodded. A lot. She's busy with work and studying, so we hardly get to talk. That's why I came here. I'm tired of being alone, staring at the 4 walls of our living room. So you're just looking for company, not looking to hook up or have one-night stands. I was a bit taken aback by her direct questions. No, I'm committed to one person. But that doesn't mean I can't enjoy the company and conversation of a woman. Andrea seemed to approve of my answer. Well then, let's keep talking. Andrea was incredibly easy to talk to. She explained how she and her husband had dedicated so much time and effort to their children that, once they had grown up and left, they realized they barely knew each other anymore. They decided to separate amicably 6 months ago, and Andrea was enjoying her newfound freedom. However, she also mentioned that she wouldn't rule out a new relationship if the right person came along. We ended up chatting for over an hour. Eventually, her friends signaled that they were leaving. Andrea seemed torn about whether to stay or not, but ultimately chose to leave with them. The fact that she even considered staying was a compliment, indicating that she must have enjoyed my company and conversation. It was refreshing after Penny's rejections. As the phone calls with Penny became fewer and shorter, lasting only 5 to 10 minutes twice a week, I consciously adopted a more relaxed attitude toward life to preserve my sanity. There was no use getting upset Penny didn't seem interested. Whenever I mentioned the diminishing calls, she dismissed me as a baby and accused me of trying to make things difficult for her with guilt trips. Didn't she understand that she was neglecting me too? Didn't she realize that I also had a lot on my plate? My protest that I wasn't whining, but simply stating facts, fell on deaf ears. In response, she didn't contact me for 5 days. I refused to let myself become miserable. I was tired of feeling frustrated and helpless, completely at Penny's mercy. So I started going to the bar several times a week to talk to people and be more sociable. It wasn't feasible for me to visit Penny the next week due to her upcoming assignments. That stung. We had been apart for 10 weeks, and I was considered inconvenient. I felt taken for granted. It seemed like she was making no effort to make time for me, for our relationship. In our last 3 calls, she didn't even bother asking what I was up to. The following week, she claimed to have a heavy period and didn't feel like welcoming me. I wasn't surprised. The following night, I broke the norm and called her cell. Her fellow student nurse housemate answered and informed me that Penny had taken sleeping pills and gone to bed, leaving her phone with her friend for some peace and quiet. Meanwhile, I was quite happy with my social life. It sure as heck beat sitting at home waiting for phone calls that never came. Phone calls that made me feel like some love-struck, lonely teenager sitting by the phone. I joined the Thursday night dart competition as one of the teams had a player get transferred out of state, and I enjoyed the Tuesday night trivia competition far more than I ever thought I would. I met some new and interesting people of both genders, always telling the single ladies I was married and not interested in cheating. I often saw Andrea, who always came for a chat when she was there with friends. She did start spending some time with one particular guy and admitted he was interesting enough to pursue a relationship with. That lasted only 2 weeks, though, before he disappeared. We were very careful to stay away from serious conversation about Penny's and my relationship, and at no time did Andrea offer an opinion on Penny or her behavior, which suited me. I was upset with my wife and her complete dismissal of me. We hadn't seen each other for 14 weeks, and the pattern of short, infrequent phone calls had continued. Worse, the times we did speak, I felt like I was imposing on her time. Sure, she was busy. Sure, she had undertaken a demanding task, combining work with study, but did that mean I had to be pushed aside, forgotten like a pair of old worn shoes? Would regular short conversations and text exchanges really be so damaging to her achieving her goal? The more time I spent with Andrea, the more I liked her. She was warm and friendly, funny and smart. I even liked it when she asked to use me. It made me feel useful. When she approached a new person at the bar or was approached, I would wait for her signal. If she wasn't interested but was having trouble getting away, she'd give me a sign and I'd come over, give her a friendly hello, and give the person the impression we were a couple. They would back off and I'd chat with Andrea until they left the bar. It worried me how much I looked forward to talking to her. She was a great conversationalist. We actually talked. We didn't flirt, unless debating Pepsi versus Coca-Cola could be considered flirting. There was never anything inappropriate. And yet, I couldn't deny feeling disappointed if I didn't see her on my nights out. For the first time in my life, I realized how someone could be tempted into an emotional connection. Suddenly, the old cliches like my spouse doesn't understand me or my spouse neglects me made sense. Not that I condoned having an affair, but I had a whole new understanding of how someone could slip and fall into one. I was tempted, very much so. It was a situation I never thought I'd find myself in, and with each passing day my ability to resist temptation weakened a little more. So far, I'd managed to control myself and not cross any boundaries, but I wasn't a saint. With daily reminders of Penny's indifference, I didn't know how much longer I could hold out. I wondered if Penny was experiencing the same thoughts and feelings, but dismissed the possibility almost immediately. She was too busy between work and study to miss me, let alone have time for being tempted by someone else. Still, we were only halfway through her training course, and I knew I had to do something or our marriage would be in trouble well before the 6 months was up, and I would be the bad guy, something I'd never imagined myself capable of being. I decided to call Penny and not wait for her to call me. "Hi, sweetheart. I can't talk long." I held back my annoyance at her opening line. Anger wouldn't be helpful. "I know. It seems like you're always busy, but I need you to make time tonight. I'll keep it brief." I heard her sigh of impatience and swallowed a bit more annoyance. "Penny, I'll get straight to the point. You have no time for me anymore. Calls are becoming fewer and farther between, and even when we do speak, you treat me as if I'm a bother. You dismiss my feelings and needs. It's like you've forgotten there are two people in our marriage. Yes, I'm here to love, support, and encourage you, but I also deserve some time and consideration." If I had hoped for my words to reach her, I was out of luck. "Oh my goodness, Mike, what are you? 2. I've spent most of my adult life putting my family first. Now it's my turn. You make it sound like I didn't put our family first as well, Penny. Like I haven't sacrificed and compromised for my family too. I gave up just as much. I have put you and the kids first in each and every way. Tell me, since you brought it up, when did I have my turn? Because I think I missed it. I must have been too busy working my sweat off to notice. So did I," Penny snapped. "How dare you imply I didn't, you ignorant jerk." I tuned her out for the next 60 or so seconds, knowing I didn't want to have memories of the hurtful things I knew she was saying. When she ran out of steam, I tried again. "Penny, our marriage is in trouble. Can't you see that? If it continues like this, or even gets worse, we won't have a marriage at all by the time you finish that course. Oh my, I've had enough of your complaining and guilt trips. Act like an adult." I didn't hear the rest of her rant because I hung up on her. It must have made her think twice because she called me back immediately. "Look, I'm sorry, Mike, but you need to understand how important this is to me. I need this. Our marriage is fine." I didn't bother arguing with her further. She wasn't listening. "Of course, I miss you terribly too, and I'm sorry you're struggling without me, but this will be good for us in the long run. You'll see. We're halfway there. When I get back, I'll take care of the house and make sure you're eating properly again." Her tone caught me off guard. She sounded condescending. I felt like a child being scolded. Yes, I was struggling without her, but not in the way she thought. She seemed to think I was incapable of taking care of myself. I looked around the room. It looked as it always had, clean, tidy, and organized. I was managing just fine with the day-to-day things. My clothes were washed, the fridge was stocked, the floors and countertops were clean, the dishes were done. She completely missed the point. Where I was struggling was in the emotional connection, the companionship. I missed my wife, friend, and partner in life. After 28 years, our lives were intertwined in every aspect, and her absence felt like a part of me had been cut off. I made a noise that she seemed to interpret as agreement. "Okay, I'm glad we got that sorted out. Now, I really must go." After she hung up, having forgotten once again to tell me she loved me, I grabbed my keys and headed off to the pub. Maybe a cold drink would help soothe my frustrations. Halfway through my first drink, I knew I'd made a mistake. I was in no mood for people or conversation. I was hurt and angry, worried, resentful, and frustrated. My stomach was filled with too many emotions to process. They churned in my belly like a heavy-duty washing machine. Even seeing Andrea's friendly smile couldn't lift my spirits. I quickly finished my drink and, with a hurried goodbye, left and returned home. I had only just walked in the door when my phone chimed with a message. "Are you okay? You weren't yourself tonight. I'm worried. Call me if you need someone to talk to." I stared at the text, my eyes stung with unshed tears. A woman I had known for all of 2 months was showing more concern for my well-being than my wife of 28 years. I sat on the couch, and for the first time since I'd met Andrea, I didn't know what to say to her. I was scared. Were we becoming too close? Was I guilty of engaging in an emotional connection? Until now, we had never spoken of Penny or the state of my marriage, and I hadn't told her things that I would be ashamed to admit to my wife, but I recognized I needed to be cautious. "I'm okay. Just had a rough day. I'll see you on Thursday if you're at the pub. Cheers, Mike." I looked at the text for a long time, checking and rechecking to make sure it sounded casual before hitting the send button. I heated up some leftovers, eating them while standing at the sink. While I ate, I realized Penny and I hadn't discussed my visit for the upcoming weekend. Penny hadn't specifically mentioned having anything planned, so I decided to book a spontaneous flight for the following Friday afternoon. I couldn't wait another week to see my wife. I needed to see her face, hear her laugh, and smell her hair to remind myself how much I loved her. While the possibility of Penny doing something wrong while away never seriously crossed my mind, I decided to keep the visit a surprise. That way, she couldn't brush me off yet again. Finally, Friday arrived. I left work early and went straight to the airport. Everything went smoothly, and by 6 in the evening, I arrived at Penny's doorstep. The doorbell was answered by a girl who I recognized from her voice as being Jenny, the girl that answered Penny's phone that day. She showed me to their small living room and explained that Penny and their other housemate, Gail, weren't back from school yet. When I pulled out my phone, she waved me away, saying she'd call Penny, seeming a little agitated. Before she had dialed 3 buttons, there was the sound of a key in the front door. Penny seemed pleasantly surprised to see me, and after a quick hug, dashed off to the bathroom. I found it odd that she took her phone with her, but with Jenny hovering, I didn't comment. Jenny and I made awkward conversation while waiting for Penny, who seemed to be taking a long time in the bathroom. She returned to the lounge area not long after, only to dash down the hall to her room, telling me to keep talking to Jenny. Jenny seemed to relax, and our conversation became less strained. Despite the age difference, I didn't feel it as we chatted. While we talked, I noticed Penny taking a load of sheets to the laundry and returning with fresh ones. I smiled. Was she trying to impress me, like when we were dating? When the room had obviously been tidied to Penny's satisfaction, she invited me to shower and freshen up with her before we went out. Despite the chilly air, Penny had opened the window to her room, which I found strange as I knew she disliked the cold. We managed to find a nice seafood restaurant that Penny had heard good things about. When Penny found my traditional seafood restaurant joke funny, "Don't believe the tales of oysters being an aphrodisiac." I had 12 once and the last 3 didn't work. I thought my decision to surprise her with this place was a success. We had a decent time, sharing 2 bottles of a good Riesling, but one thing spoiled the evening. It made the night just okay. Instead of great, Penny kept interrupting our conversations to read and respond to texts. I wondered if I should say something about it since we had always taught our kids that this kind of behavior is rude. I decided to bring it up, even though it could potentially ruin the evening. "Oh, sweetheart, you know I wouldn't normally do this, but since I'm one of the older students here, some of the younger ones look up to me for guidance. I won't be long." And with that, she replied to another text. As we enjoyed our salmon and sent more texts, Penny asked how long I planned to stay because she had 2 assignments to complete over the weekend. I tried not to feel offended by her question. I had just arrived and she was already suggesting that I leave. Despite my desire to spend alone time with Penny, I took my time over dinner, trying to win her over like we were young lovers again instead of an old married couple who knew each other very well. Because of this, it was already 11 o'clock when we walked hand in hand back to Penny's place, which was about 7 blocks away. When we arrived, we noticed another car in the driveway. Penny explained that it belonged to Gail, who had a part-time job as a waitress to help with her studies and usually finished around 10. The apartment was quiet, with only the hall light left on for a bit of visibility as we walked in. After dinner, wine, and a shower we had earlier, I was feeling extremely fresh. However, they say heaven and hell are only separated by a thin line. This proved to be true. Right before I completely lost control, there was an impatient banging on the bedroom door. A voice I didn't recognize shouted, "Penny." "Jake." "Seriously? 3 nights in a row? I need some peace and quiet to sleep." It was like a wake-up call that instantly extinguished my mood. Suddenly, everything made sense. The strange distance between us, the decreasing phone calls, her resistance to my visits, the sudden sheet changes. Even the lengthy bathroom trips when she first arrived home and found me there. I could picture her in the bathroom, whispering to her boyfriend about changing plans. Was that who she had been texting at the restaurant? I could tell she knew she needed to say something to salvage the situation, but had no idea how to do it. I looked down at her. Her hair was messy. Her makeup was smudged. She now looked like what she was, an unfaithful person. All I could see was a deceitful woman. I instinctively knew that I had to leave before my anger got the best of me, and I ended up hurting her. She wasn't worth going to jail for. I hastily put on my scattered clothes, and with only my unpacked carry-on luggage left to close, rushed to zip it shut. Throughout this entire process, I avoided looking at her. I couldn't bear to see her, as my self-control was already on thin ice. Penny clearly didn't grasp how close I was to letting my anger consume me as she continued to scream at me. Her words barely registered in my mind. 6 months is a long time. You've only been away for 15 weeks, and I suspect you've been involved with someone else for weeks now. And what about me? Wasn't I alone for the same amount of time? All the other students are dating each other. How many of the other students are married? They made me feel young and free again. Not like someone about to become a grandmother. Thanks for letting me know that there's more to Jake than meets the eye. We can get through this. No, we definitely cannot. Penny's screams grew louder and more frantic as I continued to make my escape. I could hear a concerned echo coming from the other side of the door. Finally, with my suitcase in hand and my shoes untied, I opened the door. It nearly hit me in the face because Gail was pushing it from the outside at the same time I pulled it from the inside. This left me face to face with a young woman who looked like Gail. Over her shoulder, I could see a disheveled Jenny as well. As I confidently walked past the bewildered housemates toward the front door, I heard, "Who are you?" Just before I slammed the outside door shut, I replied with a smirk, "Penny's ex-husband," emphasizing the ex, and disappeared into the night. I had a flight to catch, a lawyer to consult, a marriage to dissolve, family and friends to inform of the sad news, a broken heart to heal, and a well-dressed woman with honey blonde hair waiting for me at a bar, someone I was eager to get to know better. Chapter 2. I sat upright when Mike picked up the phone. I had expected to leave a message on his voicemail like I had with all my other calls over the past 4 days. "Hi, Penelope, what's up? I can't talk for long." Even though I had planned for heartbreak or anger during this conversation, I was left speechless because of his tone. It caught me off guard. He sounded neither heartbroken nor enraged, which was what I had prepared for. I hadn't anticipated him sounding indifferent. Neutral, as if I was nothing more than an acquaintance. In the silence that followed, I heard him sigh out of impatience. It sounded loud, and I panicked, fearing that he would hang up on me. "Please make it quick, Penelope. I don't have all day. I'm busy. Tonight is trivia night." Trivia night? How could that make him busy? How could he prioritize it over our marriage? Words to that effect came out of my mouth before I could filter them. "Clearly, Penelope, you don't understand how important this is to me. I need this." I cringed, hearing an echo of previous conversations of the last 3 months. Part of me felt ashamed of those conversations, but Mike throwing them back in my face angered me. "Please don't minimize our marriage this way. We need to talk." I might as well not have spoken. Look, I have to go. The team is relying on my history knowledge. I can't let them down. Talk to you later. I stared, disbelieving, at my phone as if the screen might prove that Mike had just hung up on me a lie. The wine I'd drunk to calm my nerves before making the call turned to vinegar in my belly, leaving a sour taste in my mouth. I fretted, regretting my decision to stay rather than fly home immediately. I shouldn't have given Mike time to cool down. I should have chased after him, vulnerable if I had to. What had stopped me? I analyzed myself. Fear, nerves, guilt, shame, and most definitely, reluctance to hear Mike call me every ugly name under the sun had all factored in to various degrees, but I had to admit, so had my training course. I'd had an important end of module examination on Monday, and, despite everything, I hadn't wanted to throw away over 3 months of hard work. Yes, I'd had a good time during my time away, but I'd also worked hard, and I didn't want it to have been for nothing. Over the weekend, I'd used the need to study for the exam as a way to distract myself in between several attempts to call Mike. The exam was yesterday. I hadn't booked a flight home yet. I knew I was procrastinating. Somehow, confronting Mike in our own home made it more real. And for some reason, the house was Mike's territory and the apartment mine. As unlikely as the possibility was, I hoped Mike would return and we could have our talk on my territory. I dropped my head into my hands. Facing reality was hard. It had been 4 days. Mike wasn't going to return to confront me. I looked at my phone again. I could see that Jake had left me a handful of messages. I ignored the temptation to open them. That, too, was hard. Very hard. The time on the screen said it was after 6. Too late to ask the course coordinator for a leave of absence. I'd have to wait until the morning. I hoped I wouldn't have to reveal in detail why I needed time off. That would be embarrassing. Surely saying I had a family emergency would suffice. Putting my phone in my pocket, I walked to the kitchen and looked in the pantry. I sighed. Everything on offer looked like too much hard work, and besides, I had no appetite. I went to my room, laid on the bed, and stared at the ceiling. I closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. My brain wouldn't shut down. How could I make Mike see that my time away was something totally separate to him and us? Something parallel, not in opposition. How could I make him understand that at no time had our marriage been at stake? I loved him, always had and always would. A flare of anger shot through me, men and their egos. Damn pride. Yes, I'd made a mistake, but only in the physical sense. In heart and mind, I was still Mike's. How could I make him understand that was what mattered? Not a bit of sweaty physical activity. Sure, I'd succumb to temptation, but just as this course would be good for us financially in the long term, so would my falling from grace be for our relationship. Couldn't he see that he'd finally get the passionate, uninhibited relationship he'd been craving for years? I rolled to my side and spied Mike's deodorant on my bedside table. He'd forgotten it in his haste to leave. I leaned over and grabbed it, bringing it to my face to smell. The familiar scent brought tears to my eyes. I closed them and turned my face into the pillow in an attempt to blot out the image of his shocked and pained face. I'd hurt him. It hadn't been my intention, but regardless, I had, and for that I was deeply sorry. Keeping the deodorant hugged to my chest, I tried to focus on the positives. I hadn't heard from any of our children. I hoped that meant Mike hadn't told them anything. He also hadn't yelled at me or called me any names. That had to be a good sign, surely? I sat bolt upright. What if the reason Mike had dodged my calls and hadn't phoned the kids was because he'd been too busy seeing lawyers, changing locks, and emptying bank accounts? What if his calm voice on the phone was him hiding his planning to harm me? Our marriage? I scrambled off the bed and raced to the lounge where I'd left my laptop. Grabbing it, I returned to my room. Blood pounded in my ears as I waited in frustration for it to boot up. It seemed to take forever. With trembling fingers, I logged into our bank account. I slumped against the pillows, and the tears trekking down my cheeks were ones of relief. Mike hadn't touched the money. I wiped the tears away with the corner of the sheet. I went to log out of the bank when a little voice cautioned me. Just because Mike hadn't emptied the accounts yet didn't mean he wouldn't. I didn't want to prompt any negative reaction from him, but also wanted to protect myself, and so I transferred a small amount to an old account in my own name. Just enough to cover airfares, taxes, and meals. I intended to log off. I truly did, but the little messenger icon showed I had messages. It got the better of my intentions. I clicked on it, and there he was. Jake, handsome, 25-year-old Jake. Jake, who was more of an age to date my daughters, but who wanted me. Me, 48-year-old me. My heart raced. My cheeks flushed, and I knew if I were to touch them, they'd be as red as roses. More tears trickled down my cheeks. Tears of frustration and longing. Despite everything, what I wanted more than anything in that moment was to call him. I wanted to hear him tell me yet again how attractive I was. I yearned to see on his face and body his longing for me. I cursed the young man who'd started it. I pushed the thought aside. It was too big, too daunting to face. Feeling terrible, I shuffled into the bathroom to have a shower. I inserted my key into the lock and turned it. It worked. I paused, bowing my head in relief. Mike hadn't changed the locks. Another good sign. He hadn't emptied bank accounts, told our children, served me with divorce papers. It was Thursday, so he'd had plenty of time to have a set drawn up and my keys still worked. Mike would forgive me. It might take time, but he would. A rush of love filled me. Mike was a good man. The best. And he loved me. He'd find a way to come to terms with it, and we'd move on. Both of us would pay a price for it. Mike would always know I'd found love with another man, and I'd have to never give in to my addiction ever again. It was a high price, to be sure, but one worth paying. I opened the door, expecting to find the house a mess. 3+ months of Mike being alone was sure to equal a huge mess. I was wrong. Everything was clean. Everything was clean. Everything was tidy, at least in the living room. I walked through to the kitchen and dining room. They were the same. Immaculate. He'd even dusted. Had he cleaned the place in preparation for my return? If so, that would be another good sign. But where was he? It was 6:30. He should be home from work and looking for dinner. I walked to the stove, holding my hand above the burners. They were as cold as stone. I checked the refrigerator. It was stocked, including a plate of roast chicken and vegetables covered in cling wrap. Had he microwaved similar for dinner? There were no dishes in the sink. Had he washed and dried them, or had he decided to eat out? I considered trying to call or text him, but after our one and only conversation on Tuesday, I didn't think he would respond. He certainly hadn't turned up at the airport to pick me up, even though I'd sent him a text with the flight details. Sighing, I filled the kettle in preparation for a much-needed cup of tea. While waiting for it to boil, I pondered the conflicting signs Mike was sending me. On one hand, he hadn't done any of the things I would expect if he decided to end our marriage, but at the same time, he ignored my messages and texts and hadn't met me at the airport. Was he just being petty and wanting to punish me? Cup of tea made, I sat at my usual place at our table. I looked at the table and the surrounding empty chairs. So many family dinners had been shared around its shiny surface. I smiled, remembering lively discussions and exchanges of teasing banter. We mightn't have been wealthy in a financial sense, but we'd certainly been so in love and happiness. I took heart in the memories. Mike would remember them too, and he was such a softie when it came to the kids. He wouldn't want them to have to choose or divide their time between us. For those reasons alone, he'd find a way to forgive me. But the question remained, where was he? Leaving my cup of tea on the table, I climbed the stairs and made my way down the hall to Mike's in my room. Okay, he'd been home. There was a faint warmth still discernible in our bathroom. Again, I was struck by the cleanliness. Not that Mike was a slob, but I had thought without my being there that he'd revert to being the stereotypical guy and not clean up after himself. Thoughtfully, I made my way back to the dining room. I sat and sipped my tea. Where was he? Where would he go? My stomach rumbled. I was hungry. I went to the fridge. Could Mike have left the chicken dinner for me? I lifted the edge of the cling wrap and smelled. It smelled good. That decided me. I popped the plate in the microwave, and while waiting for it to beep, set myself a place at the table. It bothered me that I had no clue where my husband was. I replayed our conversations of the last 16 weeks. What had Mike said he was doing to keep himself amused? There was surprisingly little to remember. I looked around the room again. It certainly didn't look like he was spending his nights at home. A sense of unease bloomed in my belly at the thought. Mike had never been one for boys' nights out or weekends away fishing. He'd always been a family man. Had that changed in my absence? Vague recollections of a name teased the edges of my mind. A name Mike had mentioned in the first few weeks of the course. Who was it again? John? Jeremy? Jason? I had a sense the name began with a J, but each alternative I came up with didn't ring any bells. And then I had it. Jeff, whose surname I couldn't remember. I dashed over to the sideboard where we kept an old address book. It was ancient, from a time before we got lazy with numbers saved into our cells. Page by page I scoured, looking for the name Jeff. I found it under S. Well, I found Geoff Saunders, and in a different colored pen a cell number had been added, and so I guessed it was the right Geoff. I punched the number into my phone. It rang a few times, then went to voicemail. I pounded the table in frustration. Would nothing go my way? The sound of the microwave beeping, reminding me I hadn't removed my heated-up leftovers, startled me. I'd totally forgotten about food. I made the decision to eat my dinner, using the time to think about what I would say once I managed to contact Geoff. The roast was surprisingly good. Once things were more settled between Mike and I'd have to get him to cook more often. While still chewing the last mouthful, I gathered up my plate and cutlery and took them to the sink. Now that the time had arrived for my second attempt to call Geoff, I was nervous. What if Mike had told him? I remembered Geoff as being somewhat outspoken. What if he had a go at me? I sighed, knowing I'd just have to take it in. Decision made, I pulled up my call history and hit redial on Geoff's number. He answered after the third ring. Hello. There was a query in his greeting. Hi Geoff, it's Penny Granger here. I was wondering if you knew where Mike is? There was a long pause and I held my breath, hoping he wouldn't just hang up on me. His silence allowed the background noise to filter through. He was clearly somewhere where other people were also gathered. Hello, Penny. Long time no see. Yes, how are you? And how is? I paused, trying to pull Geoff's wife's name from the recesses of my mind. Jane and the kids? Jean's great, he replied, emphasizing his wife's name. I cringed. This was so not the time to get her name wrong and potentially offend her husband. We're all great. And you? I didn't think I imagined the tone in Geoff's last question. He knew. I've been better. Is Mike with you? Yes, he is. And where would you be? At the couple's dart competition. I gritted my teeth, biting back a sarcastic reply. Geoff knew I wanted to know where my husband was. I'd asked twice, but it was abundantly clear he was going to make the exercise of giving me the information the equivalent of pulling teeth. Sounds lovely. And where would that comp be? At the pub. Which pub? My local one. I closed my eyes. Frustrating smartass. And what would the name of your local pub be? I asked, keeping my tone pleasant with effort. The Royal. Not wanting to give him the satisfaction of asking for the address, I thanked him and rang off. His parting words, scathingly delivered, frustrated me. Anything for Mike's better half. Sarcastic jerk. I pulled up an internet browser and Googled the Royal. Turns out there was more than one. There was the Royal Arms, the Royal George, and the Royal Oak. Annoying. It took me another 10 minutes of visiting each of the pub's websites to ascertain it was the Royal Oak that was hosting a couple's darts competition. I grabbed my handbag, only stopping long enough in the entryway to check my hair and makeup were still passable. Neither were. I scowled at my reflection as I rummaged around in my bag for my makeup purse and a comb. 5 minutes later, I was presentable and on my way out the door. After throwing my bag onto the passenger seat of my Toyota, I started the engine, and while I waited for the garage door to open, punched the street address of the Royal into the GPS. Thankfully, it was going to be a short drive. Both my patience and nerves were stretched to their respective limits. I was relieved to find the pub had its own parking lot, though there wasn't many spaces left. The couple's dart comp must be popular. It was only at that thought that I paused. What was Mike doing at a couple's comp? Was he just there to cheer on Geoff and Jean? I swallowed down my unease and headed for the entry. I followed the noise. It led me to a room set with tables. Against the far wall, 2 dartboards were set up and games were underway. I scanned the room and found Mike to the far left. His face was turned toward one of the dart games. Beside him sat an attractive blonde. She wasn't watching the game. She was watching the entryway. She stared directly at me. Her expression said it all. She knew. Heat crept up my neck. I could feel it suffusing my face. I watched as she gave Mike's arm a gentle squeeze. He turned and looked directly at me. I don't know what I expected: pain, grief, anger, the look of someone who'd had many sleepless nights. Whatever my expectation, I was disappointed. He looked as he always had. I think that was what kept me rooted to the spot. My gaze was locked to his. I couldn't tear mine away. In my peripheral vision, I noticed the blonde squeeze his arm yet again. My heart sank when I saw Mike place his hand over hers and pat it reassuringly. The gesture spoke of familiarity. It spoke of friendship, of concern. And then Mike was gone, blocked from view by broad shoulders. The man was standing in my personal space. I took a step backward. I didn't recognize him until he spoke. "Hello, Penny?" "Ah, Juff." I stammered. "I've come to find Mike." I gathered that. "And, I'd like to thank you." "Has he been okay?" "I mean, I know he must have been upset after he returned from visiting me. I hope it didn't impose on you and Jean too much." "He's been fine." "Good, great actually." That confused me. Good? Great? How could he be great after? I couldn't finish the sentence. After he found out you'd been cheating on him for the last 4 months. The heat in my cheeks intensified. It felt like they were on fire. Guilty or not, it was bad form for him to give voice to my indiscretions. I gave him a withering glance, wishing I had the ability to turn him into a pile of ash with it. Jeff laughed at me. My anger increased. I clenched my fists. "Yes, not that it's any of your business. I highly doubt Mike is great as you say. We've been married 28 years and he loves me. I know he must be devastated. He's just been covering that up so as not to make you feel awkward and uncomfortable." "Him. He's a good actor then." I had to agree. A glance over Geoff's shoulder told me Mike was doing an excellent job of looking unconcerned. So unconcerned, he and the blonde were now standing before one of the dart boards with Mike readying to throw his first dart. It appeared the blonde was his partner. I didn't like that. I didn't like that one bit. Despite my attraction to men who were much younger than me, I couldn't ignore their qualities. They were like fluffy clouds, light and sweet, but not satisfying as a main course. Mike, on the other hand, was like a juicy steak. Filling and best enjoyed slowly to truly appreciate. "Who's that lady?" I hated having to ask, but my curiosity outweighed my fear of showing vulnerability. Jeff turned to look at Mike and the blonde woman, smiling. "Oh, that's Andrea." Once again, Jeff was being frustrating, only answering the immediate question without giving any extra details. "Is she here with someone? Is she married?" Hoping to get both answers at once by asking 2 questions. Yes and no. I was tired and stressed, which made it even harder to remain patient. To clarify, is she here with someone and not married? Yes. The unease in my stomach intensified, and a part of me wanted to walk away and avoid asking the next logical question. I was almost certain I wouldn't like the answer. Who is she here with? Mike. Even though I prepared myself mentally, I stumbled backward as if I had been slapped. Well, that didn't take him long, I blurted out, the pain overriding my ability to filter my words. On the contrary, Geoff said, his eyes piercing through me like lasers. He's had 4 months to get used to being single. He looked at Mike and the blonde woman again, smiling. I guess he's adapted quickly. He returned his gaze to me, the smile disappearing. His tone cut through me like a knife. But then again, so have you. Epilogue, it's been 8 years since Mike and I divorced, and there's not a day that goes by that I don't regret the choices that led to our separation. Sure, once I accepted that getting back together wasn't an option, I indulged in my preference for younger partners, but it was an empty victory. I quickly realized that a constant diet of sweetness was ultimately unsatisfying and, like any addiction, it exhibited diminishing returns. I spent 8 years chasing that elusive first thrill. If only I had realized back then that I was destined to fail. I try not to dwell on the numerous flings I've had, which seem to get shorter and shorter in duration. Even less, I don't want to think about the other forbidden lines I've crossed. Once upon a time, I was reserved when it came to love, fearful that showing too much would lead my partner to think poorly of me. Now, I've had more relationships than I can count on my fingers and toes, multiplied by 3. Now, I've done things I hope my children never discover. My relationship with them is already strained enough. Glancing around the kitchen and dining room, all I feel is despair. These rooms are empty without Mike. He brought warmth and laughter. Now, they sit in silence. They used to be part of a home, but now they're just part of a house. I suppose I should consider myself lucky that Mike agreed to sell me his share in the house for less than it's worth, especially considering I never finished my nursing course and remained, to this day, working as a general nurse. But it's hard to feel fortunate when I know why he was so generous. Andrea, that irritating woman, was wealthy and she wanted Mike, with or without his money. I know for a fact that they are currently traveling the world together. Scotland, Venice, Florence, the Greek islands, the whole works. I know because they've paid for all of the kids, hers and his, as well as the grandkids, to meet them in Hawaii in a few weeks. That means another Christmas alone for me. Again, I check my watch. It's time to head to work. I grab my purse and make my way to the front door. Out of habit, I glance at my reflection in the mirror. I cringe. I'm 56, and age is catching up to me fast. It's becoming increasingly difficult to attract younger guys. In reality, the young guys are no longer that young. They're in their 30s or even 40s rather than their 20s. I sigh with resignation. What else can I do? Men my age, eligible men, are hard to come by. The good ones, at least. And whether they're good or bad, none of them want to marry me. My reputation precedes me. The only escape would be to move to a different part of the country and start over. But that would mean being far away from my children. I don't see them enough as it is, and putting a whole continent between us would only make it worse. While Mike and his annoying Andrea are probably relaxing and sipping tropical drinks, I'm off to clean up after patients and perform medical tasks. I'll spend my remaining days as a general nurse, having ruined both my marriage and my career. And for what? For a taste of sweetness. Sweet but bitter sweetness. I hold back tears of self-pity. There's no point in crying. No one cares.